We had 12 chat rooms running simultaneously, with delegates able to visit any 5 of their choice. 20 to 30-minute sessions plus Q&A. Given it's an interactive session, the audio is sometimes affected, so apologies in advance.
My name is Chris Larkin, and I was meant to do this with Laurie. Laurie's a landscape architect, and the front of this is what he has written down, and it's all the things that really a landscape architect would be thinking about, or anybody who's designing a garden could and should be thinking about. And I think most of you would be living in homes where you're managing your garden and refreshing it, renewing it, revisiting it as you need to. No garden stands still. And I have a sort of favourite saying that I don't want anybody to pinch, and it is that we are part of the change agents in a garden, and we must enter the dynamic. A garden is a dynamic space. It's living, growing, changing, and we are part of that dynamic, the dynamics of the garden. We're not just the handmaidens, we're actually the change agents as well. The other side is me, because we're an Australian Plant Society, and I thought we really needed to talk about primarily how we use plants in the garden, what we need to be thinking about in doing that. That being said, I'm not going to run through this. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm just going to talk. This garden is more typical of a garden that we see. Only when we walk down a suburban street, we normally see a border garden. And really, the border garden is, usually a rectangular space, and it frames a lawn. And the problem for that can be, well, not only can it be a bit boring, a bit uninteresting, but also it can be a difficulty of coping with the dry grass in summer. I mean, it wouldn't make me happy to look at dry grass in summer, I've got to tell you. But anyway, that's a choice that people make. But if you have that kind of garden, it is very easy to convert it into a garden without lawn. You can convert this sort of garden into this sort of garden if you wished. This has got quite a nice entry into it. It's not just a simple rectangle. But you can imagine that you could put in a centre garden bed there. It might have a central tree in it, or it might all be kept low. And you could have a path that goes around that. And that will convert that into what's called a stroll garden. It means you can get more plants in it, but it also means with a stroll garden, it means that you have that feeling of being in a garden. You don't have the feeling of being in a garden when you've got a border garden. You have a feeling of viewing a garden, but not being enclosed in that garden. So when you look at something like this, you are in that garden space. And the fact that the same plants or similar plants have been used either side makes you really feel that you have entered almost, you've made a pathway through something, which is lovely. And as I've been saying to the groups, really with any kind of design, like architectural design or any design, we really are after an emotional response. All sorts of analytical work goes into a design, and when you're looking at your garden and making changes, you need to get your critical eye going. You need to look at what is working and what isn't working, why it isn't working, because you want a different emotional response. So when you go into this sort of garden, it's a different response, emotional response to walking into this garden, I would suggest. This is a more relaxed emotional response. You go into most of these gardens these days that are, hedged gardens, and they're very, they're sort of uptight kind of gardens. I can imagine coming home from the office and not feeling relaxed when I walk into my garden, but feeling just more of the same, just more uptight. Whereas if you go into something that's like that, and this garden's been in the open garden scheme, and that's got no lawn in it at all. There were young people who came and just sat in that garden, just sat, and they were so transported. And they said that it was just so beautiful to be in. This garden transports you to another place. This is a normal quarter-acre block, and you have no sense of that being a normal quarter-acre block when you go into it. This is a stroll garden as well, with the path going around here. And you can see that the use of lower plants here, I think it's important, the trees are important. You take a good way of thinking about trees, we'll talk a bit about trees. If you look and remove trees from a garden, you'll get a sense that everything has shrunk. The trees give you the scale. So even when you remove the trees from that, it's a different look altogether. But this garden bed is kept low. That means there's a greater feeling of space in that garden because of that. If that had very tall shrubs in it, you would be sort of walking around a bit of a hedge. So we see a lot of lovely detail in keeping it low. We also have space. Space is important for sunlight getting in, for airflow. That means for the health of the garden. So there's so many reasons to maintain, or if your garden's a bit too shrubbed up, to think about how you can get more space in your garden. One of the critical ways of getting space in a garden is ground covering plants, and ground covering plants will replace mulch. So they're beautiful, but they're doing a very important job of protecting the soils and protecting the root system, not just of that plant, but I actually grow plants up through ground covering plants, so they're protecting the root systems also of neighbouring plants. Small plants will also do quite a job with respect to that. If you're in a position of making use of borrowed landscape, I don't have a good picture here of a suburban situation, but it's often the case that you can make use of a neighbouring eucalypt or tall tree to your liking. Block it if it's not to your liking. And with this, you see that in those plants going back in that landscape, that there's that feeling of depth being created. You take those trees out again, you've got a flatter look, and the connection isn't being made. The trees are the things that are helping connect you further into that picture. And lower shrubs, of course, so that you can see a lot of what's going on. This person has maintained or organised that they can see distant views This is something that can be at initial thinking stage to bring in water, or and even using what's the name of the preformed ones? I'm trying to think of the name of what they use. I've even seen those preformed ponds very effectively landscaped. I think it's not necessarily an easy job to do, but I've seen them effectively done. With Gardens for Wildlife, which started in the municipality that I live in and has spread to a lot of Australia, it's one of the things they talk about for insect life, because it's the larval stages of dragonflies that actually keep the mosquito larvae at bay. They actually eat that. So if you get an ecology going in your pond, you shouldn't have mosquitoes, but you should have other invertebrates, and you should be able to breed frogs if they can get to your pond. This seems to have moisture in it, but you can also, many people are now using dry creek beds, not just for the visual effect, but sometimes in terms of drainage. Some people are even running their stormwater off their roofs down through this sort of thing into the proper stormwater drain. You need to make those connections. But also these sort of things can operate as Hunt talked about in a book that he wrote a few decades ago now, this hill and channel method of gardening, where deep channels, half a metre to a metre channels, are dug and filled with rubble. And the idea is to get water deeply into the soils, and that water is taken up through capillary action in drier times. And I've seen that employed in a front yard of a normal suburban block in Melbourne, and it's not, the person doesn't, he's used it within garden beds, and he did not water during the drought, the 10 to 14 year drought. He didn't water. That's a combination of using that system of water harvesting and plant choice. You know, you still got to know your plants, and choose that appropriately. I don't think you lost anything either.
Now, how close do you have to put the channel to your plants?
How close?
How close would you dig your channel to your garden?
Oh, they're in the middle of the garden. His are in the middle of his garden, and you don't even notice that they're there, because by the time you're growing, your ground covers and your shrubs. But you might want to make a feature of it. You know, you might want to seriously, exploit that idea. But no, in his case, I think the average person looking at his garden probably wouldn't even notice that, but they are there. I mean, some people would use them almost as pathways. You know, you could use them as paths. I think in my case, I'm on an acre on a slope, and I've got several pathways running across my garden, and that means that the water comes down the slope. It's slowed by the pathway running across and percolating. Another garden bed, rain on it, but also the percolating goes down. Garden path slows it. So anything you can do to slow and to harvest if you're in that environment, and we're not all in Australia in the same environment. I can't help anybody who's in the floods, because, this is a system for dry times and drought, or just normal seasonal dry times. This is a good system.
What do you use for your pathways? Crushed rock?
Around my house, I use a crushed rock. This is my garden. That's my garden. But I don't use it beyond around the house, because it's a wonderful seed. It's wonderful for seeds. So I use mulch. Beyond that.
How crushed is the rock? Very.
They normally sell rock, like I think we used to do a Lilydale rock, and they're now doing a sort of one that's like it. Go to your suppliers of this sort of thing and ask them.
Yeah, we have. It's very fine, the one we've got.
Yeah, it sounds like granitic sand. I know Bev had that for a while. This woman had a granitic sand and she really wasn't happy with it. So she's put in more the Lilydale toppings, which is not so fine.
Is it a sandstone, this Lilydale stuff?
No, it is a crushed rock. It has a level of clay in it to help it bind, but it is a crushed rock. It's not the, I think it's granitic sand, which is a lot finer. And I can't remember the problem she had with it, but she wasn't happy.
It would depend on how much wash you have.
How much water?
Wash, yes.
Yes.
Water going through with the road,
Yes.
some of the paths very easily, depending on the aggregate.
Yes,
You
yes.
wouldn't recommend blue metal, would you?
Oh, it's a bit harsh. That's a bit too big. At any time, I was saying about hunt. I mean, this is my garden where I'm combining,
Beautiful.
Water features with, low shrubs and tall shrubs and all the rest of it. But at any time you can think, are you happy with your front approach in your garden too? Normally they're those border gardens, and this is an alternative, this one here, to, I guess, a normal border garden. This approach to the front of the house it appears fairly straight to me, but it's been softened by the use of ground covering plants so that the hard edge of that straight path is now appearing a lot more curvy and a lot more inviting. There's the balance of these shrubs. You might want to keep it a lot lower. I'm not suggesting, this is what you want. I'm just looking at the fact that you can have a garden and almost a stroll garden also in your front garden. And you can think about what is the invitation you are making to yourself as well of that front entry to your home. That's a lot bigger block. That's a lovely open space, isn't it, that one? Quite nice. But without the trees it'd be nothing. I think it is a good exercise to look at gardens and remove trees in your imagination and see how flat it all becomes. The other thing I'm very keen on people thinking about is what it is like to look into your garden from inside. And when you're making any changes to your garden, is there any way that you can improve the look? Now, this is a big look. This is Bev Hanson's garden. She designed it right from word go. That's what she did. She was a landscape gardener. There's a huge invitation to walk out there. But it also means on a rainy day or a day that it's too hot, you can still engage, you can still enjoy the experience of looking into your garden. But there are windows, and I've got one at home that's a bit more like this one, and not everyone will see it, but I can see a tree through there. And I've got a window in my kitchen, and all you see is the branches of the tree and the foliage, and just that very simple picture is just delightful. And one of my friends, it's her very favourite window in the whole house. It's also possible, I've got windows like this as well, and one place I've got a bird bath, and it's near a shrub that's about that tall. That means they can hop through that shrub and they can hop onto that bird bath with safety. And I've got, scrub wrens and thornbills and that kind of small bird making use of the protection to get in, but I'm watching them, they're just on the other side of the glass. So it's possible to do that. If you're with New South Wales or Victoria, I wrote an article for the newsletter or for the magazine, Growing Australian, and it's been picked up by New South Wales. And that article is looking outside, and it's in their latest newsletter. and it discusses this very idea.
Lovely.
Yeah. Have you any questions at this point, or will I? Yes.
At the end of our long driveway, we've got a roundabout. But currently, we inherited what's a common hedge? Anyway, it's dying.
Virginia.
No, the Maria.
Maria, oh yeah.
It's only that big nail died in all the rain, and I'd like to replace it. Should I replace it with a hedge, or should I soften it and make it a mix, or what? There's roses there too. I'm stuck with them.
Ah, well, is it your land or is it?
Yes.
I'd probably be softening it. Because I like, that's one of the things I really like is this, the more sort of arching nature of a lot of our foliage, the lack of stiffness in it, and I think this.
So I shouldn't replace it with all the same plant.
Well, you could use a very limited pellet if you want to. You definitely need to have repetition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'd be looking at some ground covers and some small shrubs and maybe something taller in the middle that becomes trunk.
Wisteria.
Oh, I hate that plant. Sorry.
I like a lot
I was
of
looking at
wisteria.
correas actually. I was thinking.
Well, correas need shade, dry shade, so you've got to look at, what the conditions are. I found correas died in the wet, but they generally like a level of shade. I shouldn't say deep shade, a level of shade.
So when you say the ground covers act as a mulch, do you think that they work better than mulch to help the soil? And where do grasses come into it as well? As like a ground cover?
Grasses as ground cover.
Yeah.
I think it is probably important to think about introducing grasses into your garden, and they look very effective with trunks. And I would probably be, I use grasses a little bit, but I'd probably be locating them in an area rather than spreading them all over the place. They can be seedy. It can be difficult if, people have tried to grow grass gardens with other little things like abertias in them. Huge work, much more work than a normal garden.
It depends what type of grasses you've got. If you use a mycorrhiza, it will take over the whole lot. Bang. If you turn around and use the barbed wire grass, it'll take over. Use thermida, it's easier to control.
Yeah, thermida is. Some people have problems with their animals with, the seeds of thermida or other grasses getting in their ears. But yeah, I agree, thermida is quite well behaved. Some of the Poa labidiaries seed quite a bit, but I've managed them quite well, I've got to say.
Yeah.
But they work very well around trunks. But I do think it's probably a good idea to group them together.
Yeah, group them and also
with respect to
using
trunks.
some of the lower plants with them.
Yeah, well, this is a perfect combination.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit, isn't it, Brockhoff's garden? I think she's got a whole garden or a whole section of native grasses. I'm not sure which one in her case. I think she mows it once a year. And it is just fabulous. But she's, this is more than likely near the sea, this. Leucophyta grows by the ocean and it needs to get wind. Otherwise it gets mouldy and that. So you've got to know, you could have that effect. I know you don't like Westringias, but you could have that effect with a grey-leafed Westringia. So it's a matter, if you like that look, it's a matter of working out what's the plants in your area that are going to thrive and do that job. And I think I've long ago stopped saying, I don't like variegated plants. After I'd said that forever and kept using them. I do use them, and I use them the same way as I use different foliage type plants. There's a big reason to use complementary foliage, again, for this cohesion in a garden. That repetition, that cohesion. But there's a big call to use things that are different. But they can be repeated as well. So in using, I'm using variegated Prestantha ovalifolia. And I'm using it here, and then you go, way down here, and I'm using it again. So I'm picking it up. I've got about 4 of them in now. Certainly, as they say, variegated foliage is great in the shade. You get a brightness from it, or semi-shade. But also, as I was saying, it's a good idea to think about sympathetic foliages, but then think, well, it'd be boring if you did that all the time.
Sympathetic foliages?
Well, fine foliages. And then go for something that's a big foliage plant like Tomasia solanaceae or Coriolana quercifolia. Quite different. And I think it's fascinating that we do have these very large leafed, furry leafed plants. I don't know that it's entered the thinking of a lot of gardeners in Australia that we do have these plants. They just seem so. I don't know that we see them that often in the bush.
You don't see them that often, but you don't see them in nurseries either.
Yeah, which is a good reason to belong to the society because you get access to a bigger variety of plants.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.